In the heart of Tokyo's Metropolitan Gymnasium, two martial arts legends collided in a clash that exposed the raw divide between tradition and ego, proving that true mastery isn't about the fight, but the fighter within. In Tokyo's Metropolitan Gymnasium, a calm karate master was about to showcase the kata that defined a lifetime. A simple demonstration turned into confrontation when Steven Seagal laughed at Chuck Norris's skills, his mockery echoing through the hushed arena. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical retired martial artist. For decades, he had been an 8-time world karate champion and U.S. Air Force veteran known for building an entire fighting system rooted in discipline and respect. When Seagal stepped forward and demanded a real fight, he had no idea he was facing a man who'd turned restraint itself into a weapon. Norris's subtle responses would ignite a larger battle of philosophies: tradition versus spectacle, respect versus ego. What began as a martial arts demonstration would become a legendary clash. The global martial arts community would never forget the night the crowd gasped at the first punch. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Tokyo Metropolitan Gymnasium hummed with anticipation. Thousands of spectators filled every seat, their collective energy creating an almost palpable current that flowed through the massive arena. Banners representing different martial arts schools hung from the rafters: karate, judo, Aikido, taekwondo, each a testament to centuries of tradition and discipline. Camera crews jostled for position along the perimeter, their lenses trained on the central demonstration area where masters from around the world would showcase their arts. Takashi Yamamoto, the Expo's veteran announcer, leaned into his microphone, his voice resonating through the hall with practiced precision. Ladies and gentlemen, the International Martial Arts Expo welcomes you to this celebration of discipline, respect, and mastery. His words carried both authority and reverence. For 3 days, we gather to honor traditions that have shaped warriors and peacekeepers alike for generations. In the front row, a figure sat with arms crossed over his chest. Steven Seagal dressed, entirely in black. His signature look completed by tinted glasses despite the indoor setting. At 57, he carried himself with the same confidence that had made him a Hollywood action star. His followers clustered nearby, hanging on his every gesture, occasionally glancing at him for reactions to the demonstrations. "Did you see his last movie?" a young fan whispered to his friend. "He took down like 20 guys without breaking a sweat. I heard he doesn't even use stunt doubles," another replied. Seagal's mouth curled into a faint smile, just enough to acknowledge. He'd heard the comments. He shifted in his seat, his trademark ponytail bobbing slightly as he tilted his head toward the stage. There was something predatory in his gaze, even hidden behind dark lenses. Watching, calculating, measuring. 3 rows behind him sat Master Teta, an 80-year-old karate legend who had trained champions for over 6 decades. His weathered hands rested on his cane, his expression serene but observant. Unlike the restless audience around him, he remained perfectly still, conserving energy as all true masters learn to do. Backstage, Chuck Norris adjusted the belt of his GI with methodical precision. At 79, his movements were deliberate but fluid, testament to decades of disciplined practice. His face, framed by its familiar beard, showed concentration rather than nervousness. For Chuck, this demonstration wasn't about showmanship. It was about honoring the art that had shaped his life since his time in Korea with the Air Force in the 1950s. 5 minutes, Mr. Norris, a young assistant said with a respectful bow. Chuck nodded, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "Thank you." He closed, his eyes for a moment centering himself. The kata he would perform, kusanku, was among the most complex in traditional karate, featuring 43 movements that flowed from defensive positions to strikes, blocks, and kicks. It wasn't about flash or spectacle. It was about precision, control, and the harmony of mind and body. You know who's out there, right? A younger American fighter lingered nearby, gesturing toward the stage. Seagal front row been running his mouth all morning about how traditional martial arts are museum pieces. Chuck's expression didn't change. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, but it doesn't matter. Chuck's voice remained even. I'm not here to impress him or anyone else. I'm here to honor the art. The younger fighter shook his head in disbelief. Man, I don't know how you stay so calm. If someone disrespected my style like that, Chuck placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. The first fight you need to win is against your own ego. Everything else follows from there. Takashi's voice boomed through the speakers again. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to introduce a true legend of martial arts, a man who has dedicated his life to the pursuit of excellence, discipline, and respect. Please welcome 8-time world karate champion, founder of Chun-Kuk-Do, and guardian of traditional martial arts values, Chuck Norris. The crowd erupted in applause as Chuck stepped onto the stage, his white GI crisp under the lights. He bowed deeply to the audience, then to the side where Master Teta and other senior practitioners sat, and finally toward the central demonstration area, acknowledging the space itself as sacred ground for martial arts. When the applause subsided, Chuck moved to the center and stood motionless. His eyes focused on some distant point, his breathing steady and controlled. The audience fell silent, the atmosphere shifting from excitement to something more reverent. In that single moment of perfect stillness, a low chuckle broke the silence. It came from the front row, Steven Seagal leaning toward one of his entourage, making some private comment with a smirk playing across his lips. It wasn't loud, but in the hushed arena, it carried. Several nearby spectators glanced over, some with disapproval, others with nervous anticipation. On stage, Chuck gave no indication he'd heard. His focus remained absolute as he began the kata, each movement flowing into the next with practiced precision. His blocks were sharp yet controlled, his strikes powerful yet restrained. This wasn't a performance meant to dazzle. It was a demonstration of martial principles refined over decades. As Chuck moved through the complex sequence, cameras tracked his every movement. On the large screens around the arena, viewers could see the subtle details, the perfect alignment of his stance, the complete focus in his eyes, the controlled power in each technique. Halfway through the kata, Seagal chuckled again, louder this time. He whispered something to his companion, who laughed nervously. The disruption rippled through the audience. Some frowned in disapproval, others shifted uncomfortably. Master, Teta's gaze shifted from Chuck to Seagal, his expression unchanged, but his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. Chuck continued without pause, his movements neither hurried nor slowed by the interruption. The kata was reaching its most difficult sequence, a combination of turns, blocks, and strikes that required perfect balance and timing. Each technique was executed with the same precision as the first, his breath control maintaining the rhythm. That gave the sequence its power as he completed the final movement, returning to the starting position with a decisive block. Chuck stood motionless once more, then bowed deeply. The audience erupted in applause, all except the small cluster surrounding Seagal, who remained seated, arms folded, that same knowing smirk playing at his lips. Chuck bowed again to Master Teta, who nodded slightly in acknowledgement. As Chuck turned to leave the stage, Takashi approached with the microphone to thank him. But before he could speak, another voice cut through the applause, if I may. Steven Seagal had risen from his seat and was approaching the stage, hand extended toward Takashi. The announcer hesitated, glancing from Seagal to Chuck with uncertainty. Chuck gave a slight nod. Permission to let events unfold as they would. Seagal took the microphone, his movement onto the stage smooth and deliberate. He turned to face the audience, standing not beside Chuck, but slightly in front of him, a subtle positioning that didn't go unnoticed by the martial artists in the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, Seagal began, his voice carrying the same confident drawl that had become his trademark in films. What we've just witnessed is certainly impressive. The word hung in the air, laden with insincerity. Impressive, he continued. In the same way, museum pieces are impressive, beautiful to look at, interesting from a historical perspective. A murmur ran through the crowd. Chuck remained still, his expression neutral. But let's be honest with ourselves. Seagal turned slightly, gesturing toward Chuck without quite looking at him. In today's world, these traditional forms are just that, forms, choreography. They're about as practical in a real fight as a ballet routine. The murmur grew louder. Some audience members called out in protest while others leaned forward, intrigued by the tension unfolding before them. Real combat, Seagal continued, his voice rising over the noise, isn't about pretty movements or ancient rituals. It's about effectiveness, adaptability, about what works when your life is on the line. He turned now to face Chuck directly, his smirk stretching into something more challenging, with all due respect to Mr. Norris and his traditional approach. The pause made it clear how little respect was actually being offered. Maybe it's time we moved beyond these outdated methods and embraced what actually works in the real world. Master Teta's knuckles whitened around his cane. Several other senior martial artists sat forward in their seats, expressions darkening. Takashi moved toward Seagal, clearly intending to reclaim the microphone and diffuse the situation. But Seagal shifted away, maintaining control of both the mic and the moment. In fact, Seagal's eyes gleamed with something dangerous. I'd be happy to demonstrate the difference. The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Cameras swung. Between Seagal's confident smirk and Chuck's impassive face, the entire arena seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Chuck's response. Chuck Norris stood perfectly still, his expression betraying nothing of his thoughts. The silence stretched for one heartbeat, then another, the tension building with each passing second. The storm that had been gathering had finally broken, and now everyone waited to see who would be left standing when it passed. The silence in the Tokyo Metropolitan Gymnasium stretched like a bowstring pulled taut, every eye fixed on Chuck Norris, waiting for his response to Seagal's brazen challenge. The camera zoomed in on his weathered face, searching for any flicker of emotion, anger, indignation, perhaps even fear, but found only composed stillness. When Chuck finally moved, it was with the same measured control he displayed throughout, his kata. He turned slightly toward Takashi, extending his hand for the microphone that Seagal still held. The gesture was neither hurried nor aggressive, simply a quiet request. Seagal hesitated, his smirk faltering momentarily before he handed over the mic with a theatrical flourish. "The floor is yours, old-timer." A ripple of uncomfortable murmurs spread through the audience. Chuck accepted the microphone, his eyes never leaving Seagal's face. When he spoke, his voice carried the same steady calm that had defined his decades in martial arts. "Thank you for your perspective, Mr. Seagal." The words were measured, neither accepting the insult nor returning it. In my 50-plus years of martial arts, I've found that different approaches serve different purposes. Traditional forms teach discipline, precision, and respect, values that extend beyond combat into daily life. Several audience members nodded, in agreement, some calling out words of support. Master Teta's expression softened slightly, a ghost of approval crossing his features. "As for effectiveness," Chuck continued, "I believe the proof of any method lies not in claims or demonstrations, but in the character it builds. Martial arts at its core is about mastering yourself before attempting to master others." Seagal's expression hardened, the smirk becoming more fixed, less natural. He shifted his weight, clearly impatient with what he perceived as philosophical evasion. "That's a beautiful sentiment," Seagal cut in, reaching for the microphone again. "But it doesn't address the reality that most of these traditional techniques would get you killed in a real fight. I've trained police and military around the world. I've used my techniques in real situations. Can you say the same about these dances?" The deliberate dismissal drew gasps from the audience. Several people stood shouting protests. Others leaned forward, excitement building at the confrontation between legends. Takashi stepped between them. His professional demeanor strained, but intact. "Gentlemen, please. This expo celebrates all martial arts traditions. There is room for many perspectives." "Absolutely." Seagal agreed with exaggerated politeness. "And my perspective is that the audience deserves to see which approach actually works." He turned to address the crowd directly. "Wouldn't you all prefer a real demonstration rather than choreographed moves?" Shouts of agreement mingled with cries of protest. The audience was dividing before their eyes. Tradition versus spectacle, respect versus controversy. Chuck handed the microphone back to Takashi, his expression unchanged. "I didn't come here for confrontation. I came to honor the art that's guided my life. If Mr. Seagal has something to demonstrate, I'm happy to yield the stage to him." The humility in the response seemed to catch Seagal off guard. He'd expected anger, defensiveness, emotions he could exploit and manipulate. Instead, he faced only composed dignity. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his face. No. Seagal recovered quickly, his voice taking on a harder edge. "What I'm proposing is a direct comparison, a demonstration of traditional versus practical. You and me." The crowd erupted at the explicit challenge. Phones rose higher. Social media. Feeds already lighting up with the confrontation. Takashi looked desperately toward the expo organizers at the side of the stage. Clearly unprepared for this deviation from the carefully planned program, Master Teta rose slowly from his seat, using his cane for support. The movement, though small, drew attention throughout the arena. As the oldest master present and a living link to karate's formative years, his mere standing created a ripple of respectful silence. "Mr. Seagal," Teta's voice was soft, yet carried clearly. "In my 80 years, I have observed that those who speak loudest about their abilities often feel the greatest need to prove themselves to others." His English was accented but precise. True mastery requires no validation. Seagal's jaw tightened, a flush creeping up his neck. With respect, Master Teta, keeping martial arts locked in tradition, is what makes people dismiss it as irrelevant. I'm trying to bring it into the present. The present? Teta raised an eyebrow or the spotlight. The barb, delivered with perfect composure, struck home. Several audience members failed to suppress their laughter. Seagal's eyes narrowed behind his. Tinted glasses, his carefully constructed persona cracking under the weight of the old master's subtle rebuke. Perhaps Teta continued, settling back into his seat. The expo would benefit from seeing Mr. Seagal's demonstration next, as scheduled. Then the audience can appreciate both approaches on their own merits. It was a diplomatic solution, offering Seagal the stage while diffusing the direct confrontation. Takashi seized the opportunity, announcing, "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now proceed with our next demonstration by Steven Seagal, showcasing his unique approach to Aikido." But Seagal remained fixed in place, his challenge unanswered, his pride now publicly at stake. "That wasn't what I proposed." He turned back to Chuck. "The audience wants to see us settle this directly, unless you're not confident in your traditional methods." The implied cowardice hung in the air. Chuck's students and supporters called out in protest, defending their master's honor. The tension in the arena ratcheted higher. Chuck looked out, at the crowd, noting the excited faces, the recording phones, the expectation of spectacle. This wasn't what martial arts meant to him. This hunger for conflict rather than demonstration, for victory rather than excellence. But he also recognized that walking away now would be seen as a concession that traditional methods couldn't stand up to scrutiny. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "If this is what the expo has become," Chuck said quietly to Takashi. Though the microphone caught his words, "perhaps there's something wrong with our approach to martial arts today." Takashi nodded sympathetically, but gestured helplessly at the crowd, now chanting for the face-off. Chuck turned to Seagal, who stood with arms crossed, smirk firmly back in place. "I didn't come here to fight, Mr. Seagal. I came to demonstrate the values and techniques of traditional karate. And I'm offering you the chance to prove they work," Seagal countered. "Unless they don't." The simple trap was sprung. Refuse and appear afraid. Accept and violate his own principles. Chuck looked toward Master Teta, whose slight nod conveyed a complex message. Sometimes defending tradition requires stepping beyond its comfortable boundaries. "Very well," Chuck said finally. "Not a fight, but a controlled demonstration comparing approaches. No intent to injure, just to illustrate principles." The crowd roared its approval. Takashi, recognizing he'd lost control of the program, tried to regain some semblance of order. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we'll have an unscheduled comparative demonstration between Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal. Please remember, this is an exhibition of techniques, not a competitive match." But his words were drowned by the crowd's excitement. This wasn't about technique anymore. It was about the collision of two legends, two philosophies, two egos, one built on quiet discipline, the other on loud confidence. Seagal removed his black leather jacket, handing it to one of his entourage who had rushed to the stage. Underneath, he wore a traditional Aikido gi-top, revealing he'd come prepared for physical demonstration. No intent to injure, he agreed with a smile that suggested limited commitment to the constraint, just to educate. As assistants quickly cleared the central area, creating space for the impromptu demonstration. Chuck centered himself. This wasn't how he'd intended to represent the art he loved. But perhaps there was a lesson here, too. That sometimes defending tradition meant adapting to unexpected challenges. In the front row, Master Teta watched with sorrowful eyes. He'd seen this story play out before. Pride, challenging wisdom, spectacle, overshadowing substance. The only question was whether the lesson would be learned before or after the fall. Behind them, the crowd's excitement built to a fever pitch. Phone cameras flashed by the hundreds. Social media already ablaze with news of the confrontation. Whatever happened next would be witnessed not just by those present, but potentially by millions online. Seagal rolled his shoulders, loosening up with theatrical flair. "Ready when you are, legend." The last word dripped with sarcasm. Chuck simply nodded, hands relaxed at his sides, breath steady. He didn't need to prepare. He'd been prepared for 50 years. The storm had fully broken now. And in its center stood two men, one fueled by the need to prove his superiority, the other reluctantly defending something far more important than personal pride. The central floor of the Tokyo Metropolitan Gymnasium had transformed. What moments ago had been a demonstration space now felt like an arena, with Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal facing each other across 8 ft of polished wood. The overhead lights seemed to intensify, casting dramatic shadows that emphasized the contrast between the two men. Chuck in his traditional white GI, Seagal in his black Aikido uniform. Takashi stood at the edge of the area, microphone in hand, but momentarily silent, uncertain how to frame what was unfolding. This wasn't part of any script or schedule. The Expo organizers huddled nearby, torn between concern over liability and recognition of the unprecedented publicity this moment would generate. "For those just joining us," Takashi finally said, his professional instincts taking over, "we are witnessing an impromptu demonstration between two martial arts legends, Chuck Norris representing traditional karate and Steven Seagal showcasing his adapted Aikido style. This is an exhibition of techniques, not a competitive match." The qualification seemed almost laughable given the tension crackling between the two men. The audience had fallen into an expectant hush, broken only by the clicking of camera shutters and the occasional whispered comment. Seagal circled slowly to his right, hands raised in Aikido's characteristic open-palmed stance. His movements were fluid and graceful despite his size, a reminder that beneath the Hollywood persona lay genuine skill developed over decades. Traditional first, he called out loud enough for nearby spectators to hear. "Show us what these ancient techniques can do." Chuck remained centered, his stance solid but not rigid, hands relaxed at his sides. "Martial arts isn't about showing off," he replied evenly. "It's about responding appropriately to the situation at hand." "Then respond to this situation," Seagal challenged, suddenly stepping forward with an open-handed strike aimed at Chuck's chest. The movement was quick for a man of Seagal's build, but to those familiar with martial arts at this level, it was telegraphed, almost deliberately so, a test rather than a serious attempt. Chuck didn't block dramatically or counterattack. He simply wasn't there when the strike arrived, having shifted his weight and rotated his body just enough for Seagal's hand to pass through empty space. The movement was so minimal, so efficient, that many in the audience didn't even register how it happened. Seagal's momentum carried him slightly forward. He recovered quickly, nodding with exaggerated appreciation. Nice evasion. Very traditional. But eventually you have to actually engage, not just avoid. "Engagement isn't always physical," Chuck replied, his voice carrying clearly despite its measured tone. "Sometimes the wisest response is no response at all." The philosophical answer drew approving nods from traditional practitioners in the audience, but Seagal scoffed openly. "Tell that to someone trying to take your head off." He launched into a more committed combination, a jab followed by a circular grab typical of Aikido, intended to control an opponent's body through joint manipulation. Again, Chuck's response was minimal but effective. A slight angling of his forearm neutralized the grab attempt, while his body position shifted just enough to disrupt Seagal's intended leverage. No wasted motion, no flashy counter, just fundamental principles applied with masterful precision. For a brief moment, surprise flickered across Seagal's face. He had expected either a dramatic counter or an ineffective response. Either would have served his narrative. This quiet efficiency was neither, and it left him momentarily uncertain how to proceed. The hesitation lasted only a heartbeat before Seagal launched a more aggressive sequence, a feinted strike followed by a rapid entry to close distance, hands seeking Chuck's collar and sleeve in Aikido's standard grip. This time, Chuck allowed the grip to land, but subtly adjusted his body position and balance, neutralizing the leverage Seagal sought to establish. To the audience, it might have appeared that Seagal had gained control, but martial artists present could see that Chuck had nullified the technique's effectiveness while expending minimal energy. "You see," Seagal announced to the crowd, gesturing to the grip he'd established. "Traditional responses leave you vulnerable to modern control techniques. From here, his demonstration was cut short as Chuck executed a nearly imperceptible weight shift that disrupted Seagal's balance just enough to loosen his grip. Chuck stepped back, returning to his centered position. "Traditional martial arts," Chuck explained calmly, "teach us that position precedes application. When your position is correct, less force is required." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the knowledgeable segments of the audience. Master Teta nodded slightly, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Seagal's expression hardened, the performative aspect of his demeanor giving way to something more genuine and more concerning. "Enough philosophy," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Let's show them something real." What followed was no longer a probing test, but a committed attack, a rapid series of Aikido entries and takedown attempts executed with genuine intent. Seagal moved with surprising speed for his size, each technique flowing into the next with practiced fluidity. Chuck's response remained measured, but now included more active defensive elements. He neutralized wrist locks before they could be established, disrupted throwing techniques with subtle shifts in balance, and occasionally used Seagal's momentum to guide him past without direct confrontation. To martial arts novices in the audience, the exchange might have appeared almost cooperative. two men demonstrating techniques without full resistance. But to trained eyes, including Master Teta's, something remarkable was unfolding. Chuck was systematically neutralizing every attack without ever appearing to actively counter. Seagal's breathing grew heavier, his movements becoming less fluid and more forceful as frustration began to set in. The narrative he'd intended to create, the obsolescence of traditional methods against his street-effective approach, was unraveling with each thwarted attempt. "This isn't realistic," Seagal announced suddenly, stepping back and addressing the crowd rather than Chuck. "In a real confrontation, techniques are applied with full intent, not this cooperative demonstration." Chuck remained silent, hands relaxed at his sides, neither agreeing nor disagreeing with the characterization. "Perhaps," Takashi interjected, sensing an opportunity to redirect the demonstration towards something more aligned with the Expo's purpose. Both masters could now explain the principles behind their approaches. This would be most educational for our audience. The principles are simple. Seagal cut in before Chuck could respond. Real combat isn't pretty. It isn't about forms or tradition or spiritual growth. It's about ending threats decisively. He turned back to Chuck, eyes narrowing. Everything else is just dance. The dismissal drew murmurs from the crowd, some of agreement, others of protest. The division that had been simmering throughout the confrontation was crystallizing into something more defined. Those who viewed martial arts as a path of personal development, and those who saw it primarily as a system of combat techniques, if I may. A new voice entered the conversation. Master Teta had risen again from his seat, his advanced age doing nothing to diminish the authority in his tone. Perhaps the demonstration would benefit from a context more aligned with traditional training methods. He gestured towards several wooden training weapons displayed on stands at the edge of the demonstration area. Bakken wooden swords, Jo staffs, and Tanto wooden knives. Used in various martial arts disciplines, weapons training reveals principles more clearly than empty-hand methods alone. Teta continued. It makes the consequences of position and timing more apparent. The suggestion hung in the air, its implications clear to everyone with martial arts experience. Training weapons wouldn't cause injury, but they would make errors in technique immediately obvious. There would be no hiding behind ambiguity or claims of pulling techniques. Chuck nodded respectfully toward Master Teta. A wise suggestion. I would be honored to participate in such a demonstration. All eyes turned to Seagal, whose expression had grown more guarded. His film career had showcased his weapons work extensively, particularly with blades. But those choreographed sequences were a far cry from the controlled but genuine pressure of training against a skilled opponent. Of course, Seagal agreed after a moment's hesitation. Weapons are my specialty, after all. A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd as assistants brought forward the training implements. Takashi, recognizing the potential for both educational value and controlled intensity, seized the opportunity to reframe the confrontation. Ladies and gentlemen, we are privileged to witness a traditional weapons demonstration between Master Norris and Master Seagal, highlighting the principles that underlie their respective arts. Chuck selected a simple Jo, a straight hardwood staff about 4 ft long, fundamental to many traditional training methods. Seagal, after examining the available weapons, chose a Bakken, the wooden training sword used in Japanese martial arts. The choice itself spoke volumes to those familiar with martial traditions. The Jo represented simplicity, versatility, and defensive principle. The Bakken, while equally traditional, carried more aggressive connotations, a weapon designed primarily to strike rather than control. As they returned to the center of the demonstration area, the atmosphere in the arena shifted again. The earlier tension of personality and ego was being channeled into something more focused, a genuine demonstration of martial principles through traditional training methods. Master Teta nodded approvingly sometimes, he reflected. The path forward required a strategic step back to fundamentals. Chuck and Seagal faced each other again, training weapons held in ready positions. The overhead lights gleamed on polished wood. For a moment, the years seemed to fall away from both men, beneath the celebrity, beyond the persona. Two martial artists, prepared to engage in one of the oldest forms of dialogue their traditions knew. "Center yourself," Master Teta called, softly from the sidelines. "Remember that the weapon is merely an extension of your principles, not a substitute for them." Seagal adjusted his grip on the bakken, its weight familiar in his hands. Chuck held the Joe in the traditional middle grip, balanced and adaptable. Their eyes met across the space between them, one gaze still carrying challenge and confidence, the other reflecting composed readiness. The paths of two men who had dedicated their lives to martial arts, who had followed those paths in radically different directions, were about to cross in a way neither had anticipated when the day began. And in that crossing might be revealed not just the effectiveness of techniques, but the character those techniques had helped to forge over decades of practice. For all the tension and drama that had preceded this moment, there was now something almost ceremonial in the atmosphere, a recognition that beyond the personalities and philosophies, beyond Hollywood and ego, they were participating in a tradition that stretched back centuries. The question that hung in the air was no longer simply whose approach was more effective, but whose approach had created the more effective human being. The hardwood floor of the demonstration area seemed to shrink as Chuck and Seagal squared off, training weapons held at ready positions. The bakken in Seagal's hands gleamed under the lights as he assumed a high stance. The wooden sword raised above his head in the classic kesagiri position, poised for a diagonal cutting strike. Chuck held the Joe in a middle grip, the staff parallel. To the ground, his posture balanced and open. The contrast in their approaches was immediately apparent. Seagal's stance projected imminent action, potential energy coiled and ready to release. Chuck's conveyed patient readiness, neither committing nor retreating. Master Teta raised a hand, then lowered it deliberately. "Hajime," he said softly. "Begin." Seagal moved first, as everyone expected. The bakken traced a whistling arc through the air as he stepped forward with surprising quickness for his size, executing a textbook diagonal cut. The technique was clean, powerful, and committed, a genuine expression of the sword art's principles rather than mere showmanship. Chuck's response came not from the standard Joe techniques taught in dojo training, but from something more fundamental, an understanding of distance, timing, and the geometry of conflict. The staff rotated in his hands as he stepped offline, its end rising to meet the bakken's path at precisely the angle needed to redirect rather than directly oppose the force of the cut. Wood met wood with a sharp crack that echoed through the arena. But unlike the dramatic clashes seen in martial arts films, there was no prolonged struggle, no test of strength. The Joe simply guided the bakken's path slightly wider than intended, allowing Chuck to establish a new position of advantage. Seagal recovered quickly, transitioning to a horizontal cut with professional smoothness. Again, Chuck's response was minimal but precisely calculated. A slight adjustment of the Joe's angle, a subtle shift in foot position, and the attack passed harmlessly by. "You're just defending," Seagal called out loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Traditional martial arts in a nutshell. All reaction, no initiative." He punctuated the criticism with a thrust aimed at Chuck's midsection, faster and less telegraphed than his previous attacks. This time, Chuck used the Joe more actively, a circular parry that not only deflected the thrust, but momentarily disrupted Seagal's structure, causing him to take a half step back to maintain balance. "Initiative doesn't always mean attacking first," Chuck replied calmly. "Sometimes it means controlling the space so effectively that your opponent must commit to disadvantageous actions." The exchange was drawing murmurs of appreciation from martial artists in the audience. This wasn't the flashy conflict many had expected, but something more subtle and, to trained eyes, more revealing. They weren't witnessing a fight, they were watching a physical dialogue about fundamental principles. Seagal's next sequence came with greater intensity, a combination of cuts and position changes designed to overwhelm Chuck's defensive methodology. The Bakken became a blur of motion, attacks flowing from multiple angles with genuine skill and committed intent. This was no longer just a demonstration. It was Seagal's determined effort to prove his point through decisive action. Chuck's response evolved as well, the Joe moving with increasing activity to meet each attack. Yet, even as his defense became more dynamic, it retained its essential economy. No wasted motion, no excessive force. Each action serving multiple purposes simultaneously. Where Seagal sought to overwhelm through intensity, Chuck neutralized through efficiency. From his position at the edge of the demonstration area, Master Teta watched with sharp eyes that missed nothing. What he saw confirmed what he had suspected from the beginning. Two highly skilled martial artists whose abilities were shaped, not just by their training, but by the philosophies they had embraced. Seagal's approach reflected his belief in dominance and overwhelming force, techniques executed with power and commitment, each intended to end the exchange decisively. Chuck's embodied his faith in position and efficiency, meeting force not with opposing force, but with strategic redirection, each movement conserving energy while maximizing effect. The audience had fallen into a hushed appreciation, the earlier atmosphere of spectacle giving way to something closer to the traditional martial arts demonstrations the Expo was meant to showcase. Even those without technical knowledge could sense they were witnessing something authentic. Two masters communicating in the ancient language of movement and counter-movement. After a particularly intense sequence, Seagal stepped back, breathing heavily but with satisfaction evident in his expression. Not bad for traditional methods, he acknowledged. The backhanded compliment delivered with a return of his trademark smirk. But defense only takes you so far. Eventually you have to engage. Engagement takes many forms, Chuck replied. His breathing controlled and even. Not all of them involve attacking. Seagal's eyes narrowed at what he perceived as another philosophical evasion. In the real world, conflicts end when someone takes decisive action. He raised the Bakken again, shifting to a lower stance. Let me show you what I mean. What followed was Seagal at his most technically impressive. A series of fluid movements that showcased why beneath the Hollywood persona and controversial reputation, he was legitimately considered a skilled martial artist. The Bakken became an extension of his body, cuts flowing into thrusts, each technique, setting up the next in a cascade of offensive pressure designed to overwhelm any defense. Chuck met the onslaught with increasing dynamism, the Joe moving in precise arcs and angles. Where before he had primarily redirected, now he actively intercepted. The staff finding the optimum point of contact to neutralize each attack before it fully developed. The exchange accelerated, wood striking wood in a rhythm that spoke of decades of training on both sides. For nearly a minute, they moved across the demonstration area. In this intense dialogue of action and response, Seagal pressed forward continuously, each technique committed and powerful. Chuck yielded space strategically, drawing his opponent into positions that gradually diminished the effectiveness of the Bakken's longer reach. Then came the moment many martial artists present had been anticipating. Seagal, frustrated by his inability to land a decisive blow, overcommitted to a downward strike, putting fractionally too much weight forward, extending slightly beyond optimal structure. The error would have been imperceptible to untrained observers. But at this level of skill, it represented a critical opening. Chuck's response was immediate but not aggressive. The Joe swept upward in a controlled arc that caught the Bakken in mid-descent, simultaneously disrupting Seagal's balance and creating an angle that placed the staff's end at a position that, had this been actual combat, would have struck Seagal's exposed throat. Chuck didn't complete the counter. He simply established the position, held it for a heartbeat so its implications were clear, then withdrew to a neutral stance, the message, was unmistakable to anyone with martial arts training. In a real encounter, the exchange would have ended decisively in that moment. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Seagal stood motionless for a second, Bakken still extended. The reality of what had just occurred, registering in his expression. Something shifted in his eyes, a flash of genuine anger quickly masked by a return of his performance persona. "Cute trick," he said, loud enough for nearby spectators to hear. "But in a real situation, things aren't so clean." He rotated his shoulders. Bakken, returning to guard position. "Let's try something with a bit more intensity, shall we?" Before Takashi or anyone else could intervene, Seagal launched into another attack sequence. But now the demonstration quality had diminished, replaced by something closer to genuine combative intent. The Bakken moved with greater speed and less control. Techniques flowing with impressive fluidity, but without the safety margins expected in a demonstration context. Mr. Seagal Takashi called out, concern evident in his voice. "Please remember this is an exhibition." His words were cut short, as Chuck once again neutralized Seagal's attack, this time with a more direct interception that stopped the Bakken's momentum completely. For a moment, they stood locked in position, Seagal pressing forward with obvious physical effort, Chuck maintaining his stance with seemingly minimal exertion. "This isn't about winning or losing," Chuck said quietly. His words meant only for Seagal, despite the microphones that caught them. "It's about what these arts teach us about ourselves." Seagal disengaged with a sharp movement. Bakken returning to a high guard. His breathing had become heavier, frustration evident in the tightness around his eyes. "That's the problem with traditional martial arts," he replied, voice rising to ensure the audience heard. "Too much philosophy, not enough reality." He punctuated the statement with a renewed attack, a combination that began with a feint before transitioning to a powerful horizontal cut aimed at Chuck's midsection. The technique was executed with skill, but also with a degree of force inappropriate for demonstration. Chuck's response showed the first sign of something beyond merely technical countering. The Joe moved with increased assertiveness, not just redirecting the Bakken, but actively controlling it, guiding Seagal's momentum into a position that momentarily compromised his balance. Seagal recovered quickly, but there was a new weariness in his movements. He had expected either to overwhelm Chuck's traditional approach or to expose its limitations against his more practical method. Instead, he found himself increasingly on the defensive despite being the aggressor, a paradox that cut to the heart of their philosophical differences. From his position at the edge of the area, Master Teta observed the shifting dynamic with knowing eyes. What had begun as a clash of techniques was revealing itself as something deeper, a contrast between two ways of being that extended far beyond martial methodology. The audience sensed it too. The earlier cheers and calls had given way to a focused silence, broken only by the sharp crack of wood meeting wood. They were witnessing not just physical techniques, but the manifestation of character through movement. Seagal's need to dominate, colliding with Chuck's centered self-containment. After another exchange that left Seagal slightly off balance, he stepped back. Bakken lowered slightly. "You know," he said, breathing heavily but maintaining his confident tone, "in a real fight, there are no rules about using only one weapon." Without waiting for a response, he motioned to one of his entourage, who quickly retrieved a tanto, a wooden training knife, and tossed it to him. Seagal caught it smoothly in his left hand, now armed with both Bakken and blade. Murmurs of concern spread through the audience. This was a significant escalation, not just technically, but symbolically. Dual weapon techniques existed in traditional training, but introducing them mid-demonstration without agreement violated the etiquette fundamental to martial arts practice. Chuck's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his stance. A subtle readiness that spoke of decades facing unexpected challenges. "If that's the path you choose," he said simply. Takashi moved to intervene, but Master Teta raised a hand, stopping him. The old master's eyes were sharp with concentration as he watched the scene unfold. This moment, he understood, had become about something far more significant than a technical demonstration. Seagal advanced with renewed confidence, the Balkan and Tanto working in coordination to create attacking patterns designed to divide, attention, and overwhelm defense. It was impressive from a technical standpoint. Genuine skill applied with committed intent. Chuck's response evolved as well. The Joe moved with increased activity, its trajectory constantly adjusting to the duel. Threats where before he had primarily used the middle section of the staff. Now he employed its full-length ends and center, becoming equally active in his defense. For several exchanges, they moved across the demonstration area in this new dynamic. Seagal pressing his advantage of weapons. Chuck adapting to the changed parameters. The intensity continued to build. Wood striking wood in complex rhythms that spoke of high-level skill on both sides. Then came a sequence that drew gasps from the martial artists present. Seagal launched a coordinated attack, Bakken sweeping horizontally while the Tanto thrust toward Chuck's midsection. It was a textbook combination that should have forced an impossible defensive choice. Chuck's response defied conventional expectation. Rather than attempting to block both weapons, he stepped into the attack, the JO moving in a tight spiral that simultaneously caught the Bakken in mid-swing and intercepted the Tanto's path. In the same flowing movement, he established a position that trapped both of Seagal's arms momentarily, while the end of the Joe rose to a point directly before Seagal's face. The entire sequence took less than a second, so fast that many in the audience didn't fully register what had happened until it was over. What they did see was the result. Seagal frozen in mid-attack. Both weapons effectively neutralized while Chuck maintained a position of complete control. For a heartbeat, they remained locked in this tableau, the physical embodiment of their philosophical difference. Seagal had sought to overwhelm through force and aggression. Chuck had responded with positioning and efficiency that rendered that force irrelevant. Chuck stepped back, returning to a neutral stance. Joe held vertically at his side in a position of non-engagement. The message was clear to everyone with eyes to see. The exchange could have ended decisively at any moment of Chuck's choosing. That it hadn't was itself a demonstration of the control and restraint central to his martial philosophy. A profound silence fell over the arena. Even those who had been cheering for confrontation seemed to recognize they had witnessed something beyond a mere contest of techniques. For a brief moment, the veil between performance and reality had parted, revealing the true nature of mastery, not domination of others, but command of oneself. Seagal remained motionless, Bakken and Tanto still extended. His expression was unreadable, behind a mask of professional control, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed the internal struggle. For a man whose identity was built on projecting unassailable confidence, this moment represented a fundamental challenge. "I believe Master Teta's voice broke the silence, measured and clear, that both demonstrations have shown us valuable aspects of martial arts practice. Perhaps we should thank both masters for their willingness to share their knowledge." The diplomatic intervention provided Seagal a dignified exit from a situation that had developed far differently than he had intended. He lowered his weapons. Slowly, the performer's mask sliding back into place as he gave a slight bow. Not to Chuck directly, but to the audience. "Always happy to give people something worth watching," he said, his voice carrying that familiar drawl, though it lacked some of its earlier confidence. "Hope you all got your money's worth." Chuck returned the Tanto and Bakken to the weapons stand with respectful care, then placed his Joe alongside them. Each movement was performed with the same mindful precision he had shown throughout. No hurry, no triumph, just the continuation of practiced discipline. When he turned back to face the audience, his expression remained calm, betraying neither victory nor vindication. He bowed deeply to Master Teta, then to the audience, and finally, most significantly, to Seagal himself. "Thank you for the opportunity to share perspectives," he said simply. The crowd erupted in applause, not the excited cheering of spectacle, but the deeper appreciation of witnessing something authentic. Many rose to their feet, including several martial arts masters who had watched the exchange with professional interest. Master Teta nodded once, satisfaction evident in his subtle smile. The lesson had been delivered not through words or philosophy, but through the irrefutable language of action, the only dialect some were capable of understanding. As Takashi moved to regain control of the program, announcing the next scheduled demonstration, Chuck and Seagal found themselves momentarily side by side at the edge of the demonstration area, away from the microphones and camera angles. There was just the private space between two men who had dedicated their lives to martial arts. However differently they had interpreted its lessons. "You could have ended it earlier," Seagal said quietly. Statement, rather than a question. Chuck nodded slightly. That wasn't the point. Then what was? Chuck considered his response carefully to show that martial arts at its best isn't about who wins or loses, but about how we conduct ourselves along the way. Seagal's expression remained guarded, but something shifted in his eyes. Not acceptance, perhaps, but the first crack in a facade that had been maintained for decades. Before he could respond, his entourage surrounded him, creating a buffer between him and the moment of vulnerability. Chuck watched as Seagal was led back to his seat, already reassuming the persona that had served him so well professionally. Confident, untouchable, larger than life. But something had changed, and everyone who had witnessed the exchange knew it. Whether they could articulate it or not, the storm had passed, leaving behind not destruction, but clarity. A reminder that, in martial arts, as in life, true power often speaks most eloquently through restraint. The remainder of the afternoon unfolded with a strange duality. On the surface, the Expo continued according to schedule, demonstrations flowing one into the next with professional smoothness. Beneath that surface, ripples from the unexpected. Confrontation between Chuck and Seagal spread through the arena like concentric circles from a stone dropped in still water. Clusters of spectators replayed what they had witnessed, perspectives colored by their own martial arts backgrounds or lack thereof. Social media was already ablaze with video clips and commentary, each person seeing in the exchange confirmation of their existing beliefs about martial arts, about Hollywood, about the men themselves. Did you see how Seagal tried to use that knife without warning? Total disrespect, one karate practitioner said to his companions. Norris was just playing it safe, countered another spectator. Seagal was the only one actually attacking in a real fight. That's exactly the point they were demonstrating, interrupted an older judo instructor. A real fight isn't a showcase, it's about effectiveness, not entertainment. Similar conversations echoed throughout the gymnasium, the clash of perspectives mirroring in miniature the larger philosophical divide the demonstration had illuminated. On the main floor, Takashi had successfully steered the program back to its planned schedule. A group of young Aikido practitioners was now demonstrating falling techniques, their bodies flowing through graceful ukemi across the mats that had replaced the wooden demonstration floor. Chuck had returned to the preparation area where he sat quietly drinking water, his GI still crisp despite the intensity of the earlier exchange. Several of his students and associates hovered nearby, their expressions a mixture of concern and barely contained excitement. "You showed him, Chuck," said one younger fighter, unable to contain himself any longer. Everyone saw who the real master was out there. Chuck looked up, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "If that's what you took from what happened, you missed the point entirely." The young man's enthusiasm faltered. "But you clearly had him. Everyone could see it." "This isn't about having or beating anyone," Chuck replied, his tone gentle but firm. "It was about demonstrating the principles that make martial arts valuable beyond fighting. discipline, respect, self-control. But Seagal was disrespectful. He tried to embarrass you in front of everyone. Chuck considered this. Perhaps, he simply believed so deeply in his approach that he felt compelled to defend it. Either way, how I responded was about honoring my principles, not reacting to his actions. Before the conversation could continue, a young, Japanese woman in Expo staff attire approached with a respectful bow. "Mr. Norris, Master Teta has asked if you would join him for tea when you are ready. He is in the private reception room." Chuck nodded his thanks. "Please tell him I would be honored." As Chuck made his way through the backstage area, he noticed the changed atmosphere. Staff members and other demonstrators offering respectful nods or slight bows as he passed. What had begun as a standard demonstration had transformed into something that would likely become part of martial arts lore, whether he wanted that or not. The private reception room was a traditional Japanese space set aside for distinguished guests. Tatami mats covered the floor, and sliding paper doors created a sense of separation from the modern sports arena outside. Master Teta knelt at a low table where a simple tea service had been arranged, his cane resting beside him. "Please." The old master gestured to the cushion across from him. "Join me." Chuck removed his shoes at the threshold and entered with a respectful bow before kneeling in the formal Seiza position across from Teta. For several moments, they observed the traditional silence as Teta prepared the tea with practiced movements that transformed the simple act into something approaching art. "Your demonstration today," Teta finally said, his English accented but precise, "was not what was planned, but perhaps it was what was needed." Chuck accepted the tea bowl with both hands and a slight bow. "I regret that it became confrontational. That goes against what I believe martial arts should represent." Teta nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the river must overcome a stone in its path to continue its journey. The confrontation is not sought, but neither can it always be avoided." They sipped their tea in contemplative silence before Teta continued. "You know, I have watched the martial arts change over my lifetime. When I began training in the 1940s, we practiced not primarily to fight others, but to forge ourselves. The goal was not victory, but improvement, each day becoming slightly better than we were the day before." Chuck nodded. "That's still at the heart of true martial arts practice. At least it should be indeed. But as these arts spread around the world, as they became entertainment and sport and business, something shifted. For many, the external form remained while the internal essence was diluted or lost entirely." Teta's eyes, sharp despite his age, studied Chuck thoughtfully. "Not for all, however. I've tried to remain true to what I learned from my teachers," Chuck said. "Not always successfully, but it's been my North Star." "It showed today," Teta replied. "Not in your techniques, impressive, as they were, but in your restraint, in your respect for both the art and your opponent, even when that respect was not fully returned." Before Chuck could respond, a commotion outside the reception room drew their attention. Voices rose in what sounded like protest, followed by the sliding door opening without the customary announcement. Steven Seagal stood in the doorway, his imposing frame filling the space. He had changed from his GI into his street clothes, all black, as was his trademark. "Excuse the interruption," Seagal said, his tone somewhere between apologetic and defiant. "They said I couldn't come back here, but I figured that didn't apply to me." Teta's expression remained neutral. "Mr. Seagal, would you care to join us for tea?" The invitation seemed to catch Seagal off guard. He had clearly expected resistance, rather than welcome. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded, removing his shoes before entering the room. His movements as he knelt at the table lacked the fluid grace he had displayed during the demonstration, suggesting unfamiliarity with formal Japanese customs, despite his years studying Aikido. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room, as Teta calmly prepared another bowl of tea. Chuck remained still, his posture relaxed but attentive, waiting to see what had prompted Seagal's unexpected appearance. "I wanted to say," Seagal began, then stopped, clearly struggling with the words. Pride warred visibly with something else on his face, something that might have been grudging respect or simply the recognition that he needed to save face after what had transpired. "Your staff work was solid." He finally managed, the compliment emerging with obvious effort. "Not what I do, but solid." Chuck inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. "Thank you. Your sword techniques showed years of dedicated practice." Another silence fell, broken only by the subtle sounds of Teta's tea preparation. When the old master spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades spent observing human nature through the lens of martial arts. In Japan, we have a concept called ma, the space between things, between notes in music, between movements in kata, between opponents in combat. This space is not empty, but full of potential. It is where meaning often resides. He passed a tea bowl to Seagal with formal precision. "Perhaps there is value in exploring the ma between your different approaches to martial arts." Seagal accepted the tea awkwardly, clearly unaccustomed to the ceremony, but making an effort to show appropriate respect. "With all due respect, Master Teta, I didn't come here for philosophy. I came because he trailed off again." The uncharacteristic hesitation, revealing how far outside his comfort zone this conversation had taken him. Seagal was accustomed to controlling narratives, to dominating spaces, both physical and social. Here, in this traditional setting, those familiar tools were unavailable to him. "Because something happened out there that didn't fit your expected script," Chuck suggested quietly. Seagal's eyes narrowed briefly. Then he gave a short nod. "Something like that. I've been doing martial arts demonstrations for decades. I know how they're supposed to go." "Perhaps," Teta interjected gently. "It went exactly as it needed to." Three men sat in silence, each contemplating the events of the day from their own perspective. Outside, the sounds of the Expo continued, announcements, applause, the constant hum of thousands of people sharing space and experience. Inside the reception room, time seemed to operate differently, creating space for reflection that the modern world rarely afforded. "You could have made me look bad out there," Seagal finally said, addressing Chuck directly. "Really bad. But you didn't." "That wasn't the purpose," Chuck replied. "Then what was? Because from where I was standing, it sure seemed like a contest." Chuck considered his response carefully. "For you, perhaps it was. For me, it was an opportunity to demonstrate that martial arts at its best isn't about dominating others, but about mastering yourself." Seagal scoffed, some of his characteristic bravado returning. "That's great for philosophy class, but in the real world, people want to see who's better, who would win in a fight. That's always been the bottom line." "Is it?" Teta asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than challenging. "Or is that simply the story we have allowed to become dominant? Look around." Seagal gestured toward the arena beyond the walls. "People didn't pay to see meditation and self-improvement. They came for action, for skill, for conflict and resolution. That's the reality." "They came for many reasons," Chuck countered, "some for spectacle." "Yes, but others to learn, to be inspired, to connect with traditions that give meaning beyond the physical techniques." Seagal shook his head, unconvinced, but perhaps less dismissive than before. "Maybe. But you can't deny that what got everyone's attention out there was the confrontation. The moment it stopped being a routine demonstration and became real, it became authentic." Teta corrected gently, which is not the same as becoming confrontational. What the audience responded to was not simply conflict, but truth. The genuine expression of principles through action. Seagal fell silent, turning the tea bowl in his hands with uncharacteristic thoughtfulness. For a man whose public persona was built on unwavering confidence, this moment of reflection represented a significant departure. "My first Aikido teacher," he said after a long pause, his voice lower and stripped of its usual performative quality, used to talk about the art as a way of reconciling the world, not conquering it. Somewhere along the way, I may have emphasized different aspects. The admission, partial though it was, hung in the air, an unexpected moment of vulnerability from a man who had built a career on projecting invulnerability. "The path of martial arts is long," Teta said, "and we all wander from it at times. The measure of a practitioner is not that they never stray, but that they recognize when they have and find their way back." Outside the reception room, the sounds of the Expo had changed. The announcement of the day's final demonstration, drawing applause from the remaining audience. The light through the paper screens had shifted as well, taking on the golden quality of late afternoon. "I should get back out there," Seagal said, placing his tea bowl on the table and preparing to rise. "My fans will be wondering where I went." "Of course," Teta nodded. "Thank you for sharing this moment with us." Seagal hesitated, something still unresolved in his expression. He looked at Chuck, the mask of casual confidence slipping just enough to reveal the question beneath. "Would you really have won if it had been real?" The question carried layers of meaning about ego, about legacy, about the stories we tell ourselves to maintain our sense of identity. It was perhaps the most honest thing Seagal had said all day. Chuck met his gaze steadily, neither aggressive nor submissive. "In true martial arts, the goal isn't to win against others, but to overcome yourself. By that measure, we're all still in the fight." Seagal held his gaze for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Not full acceptance, perhaps, but the first crack in a foundation that had supported his self-image for decades. Without another word, he rose, bowed with surprising correctness to Master Teta, and nodded to Chuck before exiting the room. When the door closed behind him, Teta released a soft breath. "An interesting man. Much talent, much conflict. We all have our battles," Chuck replied. "Some are just more visible than others." Teta nodded, his ancient eyes reflecting wisdom earned through decades of observing human nature through the lens of martial arts. "Today, I believe many people witnessed something beyond technique. They saw the spirit that animates true martial arts, not through lectures or philosophy, but through action and choice." Chuck considered this. "I hope so. In the end, that's what matters. Not who can defeat whom, but what values we demonstrate along the way." Indeed, Teta raised his tea in a subtle gesture of respect. The loudest lessons are often taught in silence. Outside, the Expo continued its program schedule. But something had changed in the atmosphere. A lesson had been demonstrated that went beyond techniques or styles, beyond personalities or philosophies. It was a reminder that in martial arts, as in life, true strength often manifests not in domination, but in restraint, not in victory over others, but mastery of oneself. And in a world increasingly drawn to spectacle and confrontation, perhaps that was the lesson most worth remembering. Evening settled over Tokyo, the city's legendary skyline igniting with countless lights as dusk deepened into night. The International Martial Arts Expo's first day had officially concluded. Thousands of attendees streaming from the Metropolitan Gymnasium into the cool evening air, their conversations animated by what they had witnessed. "I still can't believe what happened with Norris and Seagal," one young practitioner said to his friends. "That's going to be all over the internet by morning." "It already is," another replied, holding up his phone. 20 million views and counting. Inside the gymnasium, as staff dismantled equipment and prepared for the next day's activities, Chuck Norris sat with the Expo organizers discussing adjustments to the following day's schedule. The confrontation with Seagal had created ripples that couldn't be ignored. "We've received requests from several news outlets for interviews with both you and Mr. Seagal," explained. Matsuda, the Expo's director. Obviously, there is no obligation to participate, but it might provide an opportunity to refocus attention on the Expo's educational purposes. I'd be happy to speak about traditional martial arts and what they offer contemporary practitioners, Chuck replied, but I won't participate in anything that frames what happened as a contest between individuals. As Chuck made his way through the now quiet hallways toward the exit, he passed a practice room where a young woman worked through a complicated kata, her movements precise but slightly hesitant at the transitions. He paused, watching for a moment, without interrupting. After completing the sequence, she noticed Chuck's presence and froze, eyes widening in recognition. "Please," he said with a gentle smile, "don't let me interrupt your practice." She bowed deeply. "Mr. Norris, thank you for what you showed today. It was inspiring." "You have excellent form," he replied, entering the room. "May I offer an observation?" For the next 15 minutes, Chuck worked with the young practitioner, offering small adjustments and insights. The interaction wasn't about celebrity or the day's events, just one martial artist sharing knowledge with another, participating in the tradition of direct transmission that had preserved these arts for centuries. As they concluded, the young woman bowed again. "Thank you, sir. Not just for the guidance, but for showing today what martial arts really means." Chuck tilted his head questioningly. "Everyone saw that you could have dominated the situation," she explained. "But you chose control instead of dominance, respect instead of humiliation. That's the difference between knowing techniques and understanding the art outside." As Chuck approached his waiting car, he noticed Steven Seagal standing near the executive entrance, engaged in conversation with a group of reporters. "Always knew it would create some buzz," Seagal was saying. "When you put two legends in the same space, people expect fireworks." Chuck slowed his pace, and Seagal caught sight of him, unexpectedly, waving him over. "Here he is, the man himself," Seagal called out. "Chuck, these folks want the inside scoop on our little demonstration today." For a moment, Chuck considered politely declining, but something in Seagal's expression gave him pause, a hint of challenge still lingering, but also something that might have been a genuine desire for resolution. "I'd be happy to share some thoughts," Chuck said, "but I think it's important we frame what happened correctly." "Absolutely," agreed one reporter eagerly. "Would you characterize it as a spontaneous competition between two different fighting philosophies?" Chuck shook his head. It wasn't a competition at all. It was a demonstration of principles, how different approaches to martial arts reflect different values and priorities. "Come on, Chuck," Seagal interjected with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "People want to know who would win in a real fight. That's what martial arts has always been about at its core." "Is it?" Chuck's tone remained conversational. "Or is that the story that sells tickets and draws viewers? In my experience, true martial arts has always been about something deeper. The development of character through discipline, respect, and continuous improvement." Throughout the impromptu discussion, Chuck noticed subtle changes in Seagal's presentation moments when the carefully constructed persona gave way to genuine reflection. When the experienced martial artist emerged from behind the action star facade as the interview concluded, Seagal turned to Chuck, his voice pitched low. "We should grab a drink. Talk about the old days before all this social media and viral video nonsense. I'd like that tomorrow, perhaps after the demonstrations." Seagal nodded, something like relief briefly visible. "I know a place, Private, good sake." The morning of the Expo's second day dawned clear and bright. By 7 a.m., Chuck was already at the gymnasium, moving through his personal training routine in one of the practice rooms. A ritual unchanged whether performing for thousands or practicing, alone. Master Teta joined him shortly after. "Your demonstration yesterday has created much discussion among the young practitioners. Many questions. Questions are good. They are how we grow. The most interesting questions have not been about techniques, Teta observed. They ask about choice, why you chose restraint when provocation was offered, why you maintained respect when disrespect was shown. The gymnasium was already filling with spectators when Chuck made his way to the preparation area. The day's schedule had been adjusted with his demonstration moved to mid-morning. Other demonstrators and staff members approached with greater deference than the previous day, some seeking brief technical advice, others simply expressing appreciation. When Takashi announced Chuck's entrance, the audience response was immediate, a standing ovation that spoke to how deeply yesterday's events had resonated. Yesterday, Chuck began once the applause subsided. Many of you witnessed an unplanned demonstration that generated considerable discussion. Today, I'd like to share what traditional martial arts training offers beyond techniques, the principles that guide not just physical movement but personal development. Throughout his presentation, he felt a particular quality of attention from the audience, not just entertainment or curiosity, but genuine engagement with the deeper aspects of martial arts practice. As promised, that evening, Chuck met Seagal at a traditional izakaya, tucked away on a quiet side street. Seagal had secured a private room and was alone. No entourage, no cameras, no performance required. "You know," Seagal said after they had shared sake in companionable silence. "I wasn't always like this," he gestured vaguely at himself. "When I started in Aikido, it was about the purity of the art. Effectiveness, yes, but also something more. The journey changes us all, sometimes in ways we don't expect. Hollywood," Seagal shook his head slightly, "it rewards certain things. Confidence becomes arrogance. Skill becomes spectacle. Before you know it, you're playing a character of yourself." Their conversation ranged widely from technical aspects of their respective arts to the challenges of maintaining authenticity in a world that rewarded image over substance. The final day of the Expo arrived with a sense of anticipation, different from the nervous energy that had preceded it. The scheduled closing ceremony had been modified to include a panel discussion featuring several masters, including both Chuck and Seagal, addressing tradition and innovation in martial arts. Martial arts has always evolved, Seagal acknowledged during the discussion, surprising many with his balanced perspective. The traditions we practice today were innovations in their time. The question isn't whether to preserve or progress, but how to do both with integrity. Chuck built on this point. The physical techniques may adapt to contemporary needs, but the core principles, discipline, respect, continuous improvement, ethical application, these remain constant across generations and styles. As the Expo drew to its conclusion, Takashi invited all the participating masters to the stage for final acknowledgments. When Chuck and Seagal stood side by side, a spontaneous standing ovation erupted. Master Teta offered closing remarks, his ancient eyes surveying the gathered crowd with quiet intensity. In traditional martial arts, we speak of mushin, the no-mind state, where technique flows without interference from ego or fear. This state cannot be achieved through force of will. It emerges naturally when the practitioner transcends concern, with winning or losing, with appearing strong or weak. He turned slightly, acknowledging Chuck and Seagal with a respectful nod. What we have witnessed these past days is more valuable than any rehearsed demonstration. We have seen how martial arts principles manifest in response to unexpected challenges, how they shape not just physical techniques, but character itself. As Chuck and Seagal parted ways outside the gymnasium, they shook hands. Not the confrontation many had anticipated days earlier, but something more meaningful. Two masters acknowledging different paths toward the same destination. "So," Seagal said with unexpected lightness. "Same time next year?" Chuck smiled. "I'll be here maybe with less drama and more substance. Speak for yourself." Seagal replied, the familiar smirk now carrying a hint of genuine humor rather than arrogance. "Drama sells tickets and substance builds character," Chuck countered. Maybe we need both, Seagal suggested, in the right proportion. Master Teta, watching from a distance, nodded with quiet satisfaction. The Expo had achieved its highest purpose, not just displaying techniques or celebrating traditions, but demonstrating how the ancient wisdom of martial arts remained profoundly relevant. The disciplining of ego in service to something larger than oneself. The storm had passed, leaving behind not destruction, but clarity, and perhaps for those with eyes to see and hearts to understand, a glimpse of what true mastery really meant. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.